We had a good number of questions coming in during July's Meaty Forum on Occupy Church. And so we sought to have these brief recordings tackling these questions that came in. And I'm joined by Pastor Joe to help us address specifically questions to do with Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2. So first of all, most of the question sought to seek an understanding of submission to the government, as we see in these two passages. So what is the submission in view in these two passages, and what is not in view in submission?
Right. I think those are important questions. First, we have to be clear and categorical that the Word of God does teach that we are to submit to authority. We are to submit to authority because, as Romans 13 reminds us, all authority is from God and He is the highest authority. And so the whole point of submitting to authority is not in the authority's ends. It's not that the earthly authorities are an ends in and of themselves, but it's because of God, the highest authority, that has granted them authority. And so their authority is delegated. It is not an absolute authority. And so because God, the one who has absolute authority, has commanded that we submit to authority, and therefore our response is one: obedience to God. We are to submit to this authority. And so we must begin with a clear-cut, unapologetic answer to that we must submit to authority as it is ordained by God.
And so what about government that is oppressive, that is tyrannical? Does God also require that reserved submission?
So again, an important question. So I use the word absolute authority when I was talking about God, and delegated authority when I was talking about earthly authority, or even angelic authority. All authority apart from God is not absolute. And that means, therefore, that there are exceptions, and we do have such exceptions in the scriptures. And I can point perhaps to a few that would help us understand. And so, in light of Romans 13, 1 to 2, let me just read that first. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. 1 Peter 2, 13 to 14. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether as to the king as supreme, or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. But there are exceptions. Submission to civil, to earthly authority is not absolute. We remember in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, and this is one of the clearest texts we have of Peter and the apostles who assert to the religious leaders who had authority over the children or over the Jews of the time in the first century. And they commanded them to stop preaching Christ, which was a command that Christ himself gave, that they should go into all nations preaching the gospel, preaching about Jesus Christ. And here our authority is coming to tell them, stop preaching about Christ. And in Acts 5:29, we see their response. They refuse to obey the authority of man, that civil or religious authority that was there. And they say, we ought to obey God rather than men. So they were commanded. It was a clear command from the religious authorities, the Sanhedrin, to stop preaching the Lord Jesus Christ. But they refused to obey because that authority was delegated. But one may think, oh, that's religious authority. What about when it comes to civil authority? And I'll take you to Exodus 1. Exodus 1 is the story of Moses, really, that is beginning. But we're given a bit of background, of context in Exodus 1. And it was after Jacob and his family in Genesis, towards the ending chapters, had come into Egypt. They were settled in Goshen, and Joseph, who was second in command, had ensured that they lived well. But now in Exodus 1, we are introduced to a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And the children of Israel began threatening him and his authority, seemingly. And so he wanted to deal with the increasing number of the Jews. And the way he did it was to command that all the male children of the Jews be killed. And he instructed the Hebrew midwives to ensure that if it was a girl, let them live. It was a boy, if it was a boy that was born, kill them at birth. So it was a population control that was given. But we're told in Exodus 1, and particularly from verses 15, as you continue on, as the Pharaoh commands it, these midwives refuse to obey. What does verse 17 say? The midwives feared God. It was because the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Now, were they disobeying? Yes. Was it a direct command? Yes. But why would they disobey a direct command of the king? We're given the answer right there at the beginning. Because the midwives feared God. Whatever Pharaoh had commanded to be done was against God's will for the world. God created mankind in his image. And God's will is not that man should take the life of man unless God himself has provided the way that should happen by granting the sword to those in authority, not to use as they please, as Romans 13 tells us, for good, to commend the good and to punish the evil.
Yeah.
And so in a case where any civil authority commands us to do that which is against God's will, God's desires, God's commandments, God's order, we are to disobey. Not because we are disobeying God, but precisely because we fear God more than we fear men. And I think that is part of the issue. And so that question goes into all kinds of spheres. In churches, where men command people or lead people astray against God's commandments, that these people that are in those churches have a responsibility to ensure that they investigate, as the Bereans did, to see if what their spiritual leaders, their pastors, bishops, whatever they may call themselves, are telling them to do that which is in accordance with God's laws and God's commandments. And if it is not the case, they must, with the disciples, the apostles, say, we must obey God rather than men. And in any other sphere, a child should be careful not to displease the Lord if he's a believer or she's a believer, and a parent is telling them to sin, because that would be disobeying God.
Yeah, as the Ephesians says that children obey your parents
in the Lord.
Yes, exactly. So that's very helpful. And now, maybe being particular to our situation here with the protests that have happened.
Right.
If one went to this protest, would he be resisting God's ordinance?
The answer depends. So the answer depends on the reason for protesting. I think this is where biblical principles must be brought to bear. It must be said that anyone who is a Christian, this is why I began by saying the first principle is for us to submit to government. Anyone who is a Christian should have that attitude even when they disagree with the government, to whichever extent. That ultimately, God has ordained that there should be authority. Now, the point of Romans 13, 1 and 2 is not to say God has ordained particular people that we are to absolutely submit ourselves to, but those offices that God has instituted for the sake of order, for the sake of a society that functions in an order and in a fashion that he intends, and that is reflective of his own order. We ought to submit. Now, when a government goes against that particular order by promoting corruption, we know that God is not corrupt. By promoting death and abduction, we know that God is not a murderer. Satan is the one that is called a murderer from the beginning. By promoting lies, bribery, all these things are against the nature of God, and therefore any authority that is exercised in this manner is not exercised in a godly manner, but in a demonic manner, for lack of a better word. And so every citizen has a responsibility at one level or another to ensure that they obey God first. And so in submitting to government, we are submitting again for the sake of the Lord, as we've read in 1 Peter 2. And so protesting is it's a means that has been provided for in the Constitution to hold our leaders accountable. These are men. They are prone to sin, they are prone to failure. Now, it so happens that we live in a democratic republic. That's what the Republic of Kenya is. And so the means that have been provided for us constitutionally are such that we are allowed to go out and give our grievances through peaceful protest. And so I would say that a Christian, still with the attitude of submission to government, should, if he is to participate in protest, should do so in a Christ-like manner. Now, there are Christians that may be convinced that the best way is to let things flow out and play out, and not necessarily to go out to protest. I think there is a conscience issue there as well. What we should be careful of is what we call the tyranny of the weak brother. Yeah. If you think that it is not particularly helpful for you to go out and protest, you should not use that as a binding principle for a Christian who thinks that this is the right way to address government that has been provided for in government, that is in line with biblical principles of accountability, of seeking justice, of doing that which is right.
Yeah. And then finally, about recalling a member of parliament competent.
Right.
Would it be going against the principles of Romans 13?
Again, the whole point of this is to ensure that we have a posture of humility, a posture of submission, rather than of rebellion and opposition. So, in doing that, are you seeking to follow through a constitutionally allowable process that allows you to recall someone that should be accountable to you as a citizen, given that the Constitution says that the people of Kenya are sovereign, and it is the powers of the people of Kenya that is being exercised through these representatives. So there's a question there of what the Constitution allows in light or in line with what the Bible commands. And those two must be held together. So for instance, let me just use the example of Parliament that happened during the protest a few weeks ago when people broke into Parliament. I would argue that a Christian is allowed biblically to participate in protest peacefully in a manner that still shows Christ-likeness. But they have lines, they have boundaries. So here's the thing. The Christian will not be liked by the government for holding them accountable. But at the same time, the Christian may not be liked by those who have no boundaries and they have the same concerns. Yeah. Because I would argue that any Christian that would have went to Parliament, or rather would have gone together with the protesters towards Parliament, knowing full well that it is a protected zone and that was not, or that's not allowed for in the Constitution, that a Christian should draw a line there and say that they would not cross that line not because they are not grieving or holding their government accountable, but precisely because they want to do it in a manner that is constitutional. And so when I say constitutional, what I mean in biblical terms is they want to do what is right. Righteousness is not just towards the leaders, it's towards the citizens as well. We must respond in righteous ways. And that means that I will not participate in throwing stones. I will not participate in using curse words. So when it comes to the issue of the member of parliament, I think the issue boils down to these are representatives of the people that must be held accountable, but we must do it in a manner that is biblical, is Christ-like. And I do not think it is in the place of a Christian to be involved in a brawl, to fight with their fists with a member of parliament, even when they agitate the citizens or even you, or ban their properties, or loot from them. That is becoming like them, unfortunately. So I think if the process of recalling a member of parliament is clear and has been provided for, and that is a means that can be used, the Christian can participate in that. But if it so happens that this member of parliament is not recalled, the Christian should submit to the outcome and wait for the next elections, whether general elections or whichever other elections come up. I mean, the Lord could, snuff the life out of such a person, and you have to go to a special by-election. Yeah. But you have to wait until the next election and exercise your right by voting if you are indeed going to do it in a Christ-like manner.
Thank you so much, Pastor Joe. This was very helpful responding to this question.
Thank you for that as well.